if you assume that street lighting can reduce crime, you would also assume that, well, if you turn the street lights off in an area or you dim them down, that is going to potentially increase crime. That seems like the logical opposite to that, I suppose. But there have been studies that have showed actually if you switch the lights off or you dim down the street lights, you turn them off, you actually get a reduction in crime rather than an increase in crime.
Welcome back to Restoring Darkness, and I can assure you today, Mark and I are quite honored to be joined by Dr. Jim Uttley. He is a lecturer in architectural science at the University of Sheffield. He's also an environmental psychologist with an interest in how the built environment influences behavior. His research focuses on the impact of darkness and lighting in two areas. One, perceptions of safety and crime risk, and two, active travel. As an example, he collaborated with the South Yorkshire Police to assess the relationship between darkness and crime risk and how lighting mediates this relationship. As a second example, he has led a 3-year project called Saturn, supporting active travel using road lighting at night to establish evidence about the impact of darkness and lighting on cycling rates. Super interesting. There's a bunch of websites, some links to his papers in the show notes. You'll find those down below. And normally, as you listeners know, Mark and I would go to the soft lights update, but due to time constrictions and the interest that both Mark and I have in this particular topic, we're going to go right to Dr. Uttley. Welcome to the Restoring Darkness podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me, and that was a really nice intro. Thanks a lot.
No problem. I actually am very interested in this topic, as I've said, and give us the lowdown of, how one goes about studying the perceptions of safety and crime risk vis-a-vis lighting and darkness.
Thanks. Good question. Straight into the method kind of stuff, which I like. So the area we're talking about here about sort of perceptions of safety, perceptions of crime and actual crime. Clearly, when we're studying perceptions of safety, we have to go to the actual kind of users of spaces and ask their opinions and perceptions. But because as a lighting researcher, I'm interested in isolating the effect that lighting might have on those perceptions of safety. And clearly, there are lots and lots of other factors that influence how safe we might feel in an environment. So, one of the ways we use to try to isolate the influence that light levels and lighting might be having on perceptions of safety is we use something called the day-dark approach. So, we essentially ask people to fill in a questionnaire which will assess their perceptions of safety. We ask a range of different questions that try to tap into things like their anxiety levels, how risky they might feel walking down a particular street might be, how safe they might feel that street is, whether they'd like to avoid that street or not, various questions, tapping into this kind of broader concept of perceived safety. But we get them to fill in that questionnaire when they're sort of walking down a particular street, both in daylight and after dark. And then we kind of look at the difference in those ratings of safety between daylight and dark, and essentially that difference tells us something about the influence that the light levels on that street might be having. So we might argue that perhaps good lighting, if I can put that in quotation marks, whatever good lighting might be, but if we have this assumption that perhaps in some way lighting might be able to improve perceptions of safety, and good lighting would do this, then good lighting would essentially try to reduce the difference between how safe we might feel in daylight and how safe we feel at dark. Because generally, it's not always the case, but very much, 99% of the time, people usually feel less safe when it's dark compared to when it's daylight. It's a sort of an inherent kind of evolutionary thing, probably. So people usually feel less safe after dark, but if we can bring sort of feelings of safety closer to how they might feel in daylight, then we might argue that any lighting in that area might be doing a good job.
Is there a known delta? Is there a known delta that between, in daytime people feel this and at nighttime it's a minimum of this? Is there? known?
Not really. It can vary. It can definitely vary depending on the space you're in, um, the people you're asking. So one of the clear differences that comes out in the evidence in the literature is the fact that this. Um, so generally, women tend to feel less safe, kind of walking the streets, than men do anyway. But this difference grows when you're comparing daylight versus dark. So that kind of delta, this sort of difference between um, daylight and dark perceptions, it can vary depending on the demographic group. So yeah, I would say there's not a specific kind of like it is this amount.
Yeah, I suppose there's a lot of things like known territory, whether they're in a different city. There could be a whole bunch of different factors. But in this case, I would say that perception is not reality. So you're looking for people's perceptions of their safety, which is completely different from crime prevention. Crime prevention is not the same thing as someone's perceptions of safety. They're studied differently, or they're different things
Yes,
to take action on.
on the whole, I would agree with that. On the whole, people's perceptions of safety don't always map on to the reality of how safe they might actually be. Sometimes it does. Sometimes people might be in an area where it feels less safe, and it actually is less safe. Like perhaps they know something about that area. Perhaps they see possible signs of a lack of safety that might turn into reality, possibly. But generally, I think you're right that somebody's perception of safety does not necessarily equal the reality of
Mm.
kind of actual crime risk and how likely they are to be a victim of crime.
I took social geography in second year university and I found the course absolutely fascinating. And the next year I lived in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and I went to Queen's University of Belfast. And it was super weird the way Catholics would walk to one destination on one route and Protestants would walk to the same destination on another route through a Protestant neighborhood as opposed to a Catholic neighborhood. And there was like this perception of space as they felt like that was less safe than this route. So I'm going to take this known route through my neighborhood as opposed to this other route. And we're kind of dealing with the same kind of factors here. It's irrational to walk longer route just through an area when you look at it from the outside, but those people have real feelings and they matter. Is that what we're into here?
Yeah, essentially, it's somebody's perception. That is their perception, and it's hard to argue to say, oh well, of course you can say, well, your perception is wrong. Like when you look at the objective facts, it might be wrong. But if a space makes somebody feel unsafe, that perception, that feeling is going to make them behave a certain way. And so, for me, this is why perceptions are still really, really important, because it's those perceptions that influence behavior.
Hmm.
And if I, so you mentioned two areas of my research, so the kind of crime and safety element, and then the active travel element. And if I look at it from an active travel lens, we want people to feel safe, so that they are encouraged to walk and to cycle. These are like modes of transport that I'm interested in getting people to do, because these are kind of good things to do. And if people don't feel safe, they're not going to do that. So you're completely accurate in saying that people's perceptions don't always map onto reality, and it's often irrational to like make different choices based on those perceptions. um, but it's those perceptions that drive behavior, and often it's behavior that we want to influence and change sometimes.
So I have one more question about the active travel, and then I'm going to ask you about the crime risk. So when it comes to the active travel, is do we how much? Let me just ask you, what do you know about that? Like what do you want to tell a bunch of people that listen to the Restoring Darkness that this is how outdoor lighting affects active travel in a city, and just what you've discovered?
Yeah, sure. So that I start with the premise that active travel is a good thing. It's something we want to encourage. Um, I also think that, rightly or wrongly, people want to travel at different times of the day, including when it's dark. Um, and where possible, we should make that available to them. We should make walking and cycling a possible transport mode option, at those different times of the day. And so one of the things we've discovered through our research, firstly, is that um, darkness deters people from walking and cycling. So when I refer to darkness, I'm talking about kind of ambient darkness. You essentially no daylight, I suppose. The difference between daylight and then when the sun goes down, sort of darkness. So the when I refer to darkness, there is still some light around, from street lights, from other types of lamps and things, but I'm talking about lack of sunlight, I suppose. And so we know essentially when the sun goes down, when it's ambient darkness, that does deter people from walking and cycling. We know this from observational studies, which essentially control for the time of the day. So when we compare numbers of people walking and cycling at the same time of the day, let's say 5 to 6 o'clock in the evening, let's say, and we compare whether that hour is in daylight or darkness, the numbers drop. It's not necessarily a huge amount, but it's significant. If we talk about sort of statistical significance, it's a notable amount.
Hmm.
So we know that darkness can deter people. So the next question would be, can we use lighting in a sort of sustainable and appropriate way to encourage people to walk or cycle when it's dark? And the research although we need to do a lot more research on this, one or two of the studies that we've done to date suggests that we only need a minimal amount of additional light to have a positive benefit on the number of people who cycle. So the study I'm particularly thinking about, we focused only on cyclists. We weren't actually looking at pedestrians, but we focused on cyclists. But you only need a small increase in sort of luminance luminances, to have a significant sort of or to significantly counter the deterrent effect of darkness. And if you go kind of much brighter, it has negligible further effects. So there's this sort of diminishing returns kind of effect going on. So you don't need huge extra levels of light to have this effect. It can be quite minimal.
It's like a wayfinding. Yeah, you're giving people the path in front of them is visible, for a long, in a far way they can see ahead of themselves. They can see the path. They know where they're going. They're more likely to use it. If you way overlight it, it makes no difference. That's basically what you're saying.
Essentially, yeah, and our eyes are super adaptive. Like, we can see pretty well, like when it's dark. So we don't need a huge amount of light to be able to, like you said, see the path ahead, figure out which way we're going, see possible hazards, potholes or curbs in the path. We don't need huge amounts of light to do these kind of fundamental visual tasks.
And does the color temperature of the light matter much?
So that's a good question. So much of our research on this at the moment hasn't really looked at color temperature. We've been focusing mainly on kind of quantity metrics like illuminance. The only thing, well, one of the things I can say about this is from kind of more fundamental sort of laboratory-based research that we've done. We do know that sort of whiter light, kind of light that has shorter wavelengths in it, can help us see better, essentially, when it's dark. So if you have equivalent kind of levels of photopic illuminance, kind of just measured in using a normal photometer, if that light is whiter, we would essentially need a slightly lower amount of that light, that illuminance, to be able to see the same thing, essentially because of the way our sort of photoreceptors in our eyes work. They tend to work, the rods that are kind of active when it's dark are a bit more effective with shorter wavelength light.
And just for the listeners, photopic and scotopic is what Dr. Uttley is referring to. Photopic being on the bluer spectrum, the same amount of light is perceived as brighter because it's whiter and bluer, whereas the exact same amount of light in a lower Kelvin temperature will be perceived as less bright, even though it's exactly the same amount of light. So that's what he was referring to, if you're not a lighting dork like me. But I'll tell you for sure, I know as selling light bulbs for 25 years, people absolutely perceive whiter light as brighter. There's absolutely no question about that. That's for sure. But there's a movement to restore darkness and to preserve night. And we know
Hmm.
that warmer Kelvin temperatures are better for animals, for wildlife, for humans in terms of their pituitary glands and all the things that happen. So are you making the case that probably we can use warmer lights? It just has to be a touch brighter.
Yeah, potentially. So this is the thing. So there's kind of when kind of LED bulbs came out, and there was this the ease in which producing sort of whiter light, it became much easier to produce whiter light. There was this, there was a definite sort of push towards having whiter light, but then I think we realized the negative impact of this. Like you've mentioned, um, whiter light can have more negative impacts on wildlife. It's not the be all and end all. And also, as we've got a better understanding of kind of the um, kind of the non-image forming aspects of light, so talking about kind of melanopic light, the
Hmm.
the impact that light has on our circadian systems and things. We understand that actually, having white light at night is not great. It's kind of
Hmm.
can disrupt our circadian system. So definitely, a more considered approach to the color temperature that we're using, the types of wavelengths that we're using. I would certainly advocate for that. Considering um, we don't need huge amounts of we don't need huge quantities of light, and so yeah, maybe we need to think a bit more about the quality of that light, and color temperature one of those sort of things we need to be thinking about.
It's interesting because I don't know if you're aware of one of your colleagues, Dr. Jennifer Veach. She was a guest on this show, and I believe it was her. So maybe someone will correct me if I'm wrong, if it was another scientist, but I believe I heard that the best definition of light is that it's information, right? So we want to deliver this information of wayfinding to people so that they'll feel comfortable riding their bike down this path. They can see the potholes and all. It's very important for active travel. Now, crime risk and safety. Um, I would rather you just start off and tell us what you know about electric light at night, crime risk. Just feel free to lay it on us.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this has been a research area that we've been looking into over the last few years. So if you, I guess the starting point is that the assumption is that like more light is better in terms of preventing crime.
Hmm.
This is the thing. If you look at a lot of the lighting standards, if you look at police guidance around this kind of topic, about crime at night, you will see that street lighting is generally considered a crime prevention tool, I suppose.
Hmm.
You look at lighting standards, say that one of the purposes of road lighting, street lighting, is to uh, possibly prevent crime, or reduce crime. So there's this assumption that street lighting can deter offenders, I suppose, and can help reduce or prevent crime. Um, and historically, there have been some studies that have supposedly supported this idea. There's been studies of individual lighting interventions that have showed that you install kind of new and improved lighting, supposedly the crime counts go down. I'm sure you're probably well aware of some systematic reviews that have been done by I forget the names, like Welsh and Farrington, I think. I don't know if you know these systematic reviews. So this is kind of where they have collated
Oh
many of these
yes,
studies that have been done.
yes. We that
Uh,
fellow. I think he was a guest on the show, Mark. Yes, I think I know who you're talking about. All the crime statistics were brought together in England or something like that. Yes.
that's basically it. So generally, like a systematic review is a type of study where they'll collate lots of different studies that have been done on a specific topic. So these guys collated the studies that had been done on lighting, sort of street lighting interventions
Hmm.
and crime, put all of those studies together to see, okay, what's the overall consensus from these, and they kind of suggested that on the whole, these lighting intervention studies suggested, if you improve the lighting in an area, and we could add, we could debate what we mean by improve, but generally I took it as meaning making the lighting brighter or installing more lighting. So if you have this improved lighting, on the whole, you see a reduction in crime. That was essentially their overall their conclusion from these systematic reviews that they've done. However, when you look into the detail of those reviews, you will see, well, there's a few issues with them. One of the main ones being that the crime actually reduced, or the stats they were using, the crime reduced in daylight as well as after dark. So if you think, like, if you're installing lighting, you would expect only the crime after dark to be influenced. So if you're getting a reduction in crime in the daytime as well, that suggests there's something else going on. It's not to do with the change in the actual light levels or anything like that. So that's one issue, and it kind of suggests, well, maybe any effect that these lighting interventions are having is because it's an investment in that area. The street lights, like if you're putting new street lights into an area, it's a sign of investment. It's a sign of kind of, the local authority is putting some investment in that area. That might then influence things like community pride, all these kinds of issues, and it's kind of that effect that might be reducing the crime, as opposed to any change in visibility or sort of light levels. So that's one issue. The other issue is that the studies that were included in these systematic reviews were generally of lighting interventions, and by that I mean, where there's been a kind of essentially a before and after, where there's been some change to the lighting. And so there hasn't really then been a longitudinal assessment of, so they might have seen an initial benefit, an initial change in crime rates after the installation of these new lights, for example. But these studies generally didn't do like a longitudinal, like they might have done 6 months after the intervention, how did crime change, rather than 5 years. So you might get an initial improvement, possibly in, a reduction in crime initially, once, because it's kind of a new, something new has happened in the neighborhood. But does that sustain over a long period? And that's something that could be questionable. So essentially what I'm trying to say is, there's the evidence about whether lighting affects crime is pretty unclear, let's say. And there's other evidence which has sort of suggested that actually, if you switch the streetlights off, so if you assume that street lighting can reduce crime, you would also assume that, well, if you turn the streetlights off in an area, or you dim them down, that is going to potentially increase crime. That seems like the logical opposite to that, I suppose. But there have been studies that have showed, actually, if you switch the lights off, or you dim down the streetlights, you turn them off, you actually get a reduction in crime rather than an increase in crime. So again, this is kind of against the sort of the idea that street lighting can benefit or can reduce crime. So really, really quite unclear evidence about the effect that lighting can have. And that was kind of our starting point. So we were thinking, well, we don't really know, like, what is the answer? And I suppose just to be really clear, I'm a lighting researcher, and I would kind of advocate for possible benefits of lighting, but I don't want excess lighting in areas where it's not of any benefit. Like, the provision of lighting should be evidence based. That's my thing as a researcher.
Yes.
So our starting point was this thing of unclear evidence. So we kind of took a step back and said, well, first of all, we need to know what effect ambient darkness has on crime, because if the crime risk doesn't change when the sun goes down, when we go from it being daylit to there being no sunlight, if there's no change in crime risk, then it seems unfathomable that street lighting could have any effect. Because if you go from daylight to darkness, that is a huge change in light levels. And any provision of street lighting is only going to change the light levels a tiny amount relative to that change that you get from daylight to darkness.
Even if you have horrible lighting, even if it won't change very much.
Yeah,
you still have lots of darkness. Yeah.
Precisely. So even the amount of light you could possibly provide from streetlights is never going to be anywhere close to daylight. So we wanted to look at, well, how does the crime risk change from daylight to sort of ambient darkness? So, and if it doesn't change, then that basically means, well, street lighting's not going to help, I don't think. So that was the first question we wanted to address. But then we also wanted to take this approach because if we could quantify any change in crime risk between daylight and darkness, that would be quite a useful measure to assess how effective street lighting might
Hmm.
be. So if you can measure the change in the risk of crime when it turns dark compared with daylight, you can use that measure to see, okay, well, if you then introduce lighting or you take lighting away, how does that measure of the risk between daylight and dark, how does that change? So that would be our like metric of the effect that darkness is having, and we can see whether that changes depending on the presence or absence of lighting. I hope that all makes sense so far.
It totally makes sense, and I could just keep asking you questions, but I'll turn it over to Mark because he is on the show as well. I don't want to hog you all to myself. I could keep going. Go ahead, Mark. I'm sure you got a ton of questions.
I do have a ton of questions, but I just want to sit here and listen. Um, there's so much interesting. Dr. Utley, when we have these guests on, it seems to me they're confirming each time what you're saying. And what Michael and I say, that the lighting neither doesn't reduce crime, it doesn't reduce vehicle crashes, it doesn't improve safety. And yet, as an activist, every city that I deal with, that is their primary reason for installing the streetlights. Number one priority is safety. And they don't typically differentiate between perception of safety and actual safety. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about this, what safety is. Is it defined? Because this word comes up all the time for us, that they need safety. And yet there's physical safety, such as wayfinding, not tripping over things. There is being attacked physically. There is a property theft issue, which some studies have shown that actually white lights increase property theft, but that's a different kind of safety. And so, what exactly do you have it, in mind? What exactly is safety?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I mean, we can clearly distinguish between. We've kind of touched on it already about the differences between perceptions of safety and actually how that might vary from the reality of actual safety. If we're talking about kind of um, the reality of safety, I suppose we would tend to think of things like. So if we're thinking about it from a lighting perspective, I guess people might argue that lighting might have certain purposes. One of those, for example, being to allow somebody to see trip hazards, for example. So that might be one element of safety, keeping somebody safe so that they can just walk the street without tripping up, I suppose. There's one element. And so we might be able to
Hmm.
talk about, well, what light levels might be needed to see trip hazards, and we've done research on this to show that actually, again, really really low light levels are needed to see a trip hazard. We don't need much light at all. I think it was my PhD research that was looking into this, and we need like less than 2 lux, which is like, if you look at street lighting standards, that's right down at the bottom end of the range that street lights will go to. Then we might be talking about kind of traffic safety, so again, one of the purposes of street lighting might be to help ensure that road users are safe, so that road users can see each other, particularly kind of if you're a vulnerable road user like a pedestrian or a cyclist, making sure that drivers can see you. So street lighting might have a purpose there, so that might be another type of safety that we're talking about. But then I think really perhaps what your question was getting at maybe was more around the kind of like safety, the crime safety perhaps. And
Hmm.
so our research, you absolutely nail on the head, really distinguishing between different types, kind of property safety as opposed to physical harm safety. And so the approach we've taken when we've been looking at kind of crime and darkness and lighting is to distinguish between different crime categories. So in our recent research that we did, I think we had maybe 14 or 15 different crime categories, which kind of covered the types of safety, I think, that you mentioned around, for example, property safety. So we have crimes like burglary, theft, these kinds of things. But then we also have physical sort of safety crimes, I suppose, like violence against the person, like sexual offences, like robbery, sort of public disorder offences as well. So I don't know if that was kind of what you were getting at, but yeah, certainly there's a need to distinguish between these different types of safety, because light is going to have different effects for these, and it might well be that the light levels has no impact on certain types of safety, but has some impact on other types of safety.
Yes, that's exactly. And so the problem is language. Then it's safety for the cities is a catch-all, and it's a sort of a cop out. Easy for them
Mm.
to say we need safety. It's very popular with the public to get elected as a city official to say we're going to do something about safety. But it's super interesting that you said, well, when they come in and they put these streetlights in that cost a lot of money, and they come in and then they say, look what we did, and we put in these streetlights. But it wasn't the streetlight. It was the fact that you paid attention to the neighborhood that
Yeah,
made them
yeah,
feel better and such.
yeah.
Um, oh, if can I ask you about the Lux a little bit? So this is really important to me. So I've seen an often maybe a street light might be producing 10 lux on the sidewalk, and the moon is something like zero point 0.1 lux. So we're talking that's even full moon. So we're talking like 100 times brighter than a full moon. And I can see and I can walk around with a full moon. So why is it 100 times brighter? You just mentioned that actually maybe 2 lux is good. I would feel much more comfortable myself walking around when it's only 2 lux on the ground and I don't have bright lights in my eyes. I would feel much better. Um, is there any? Does your research propagate to anybody that is anybody paying attention to the fact that 2 lux actually would be a better number?
Yeah, we are. So currently, I'm not sure how well aware you are. So currently, we're trying to get the sort of the international road lighting standards revised at the moment, because at the moment, I don't know how, like, stop me if I'm getting a bit too technical, but there's a document called CIE 115. I don't know if you've heard of this at all. It's a standards document which will specify kind of the light levels that should be put in place on different types of streets based on different criteria, and it's kind of an international standard. Not necessarily every country adopts it, but it's kind of broadly international. Um, but we've done quite a bit of research around this essentially to demonstrate that the evidence and the justifications behind these standards are pretty, I don't, to be polite, the they're basically not there. There's essentially no evidence to support these standards.
Right.
Hmm.
So we're currently trying to promote a revision of these standards, and in that revision, we essentially want to look at well, what are the key purposes? Why do we have lighting? Like, why do we have streetlights? What are the purposes? And what, if we're going to light our streets and urban environments, what light levels do we need? Because clearly there's lots and lots of reasons why we don't want to excessively light, in terms of energy costs, um, you know light pollution, dark skies, uh,
Keep going.
the ecology, wildlife, all loads
Yeah,
and
you
loads of
can just go
factors.
on and on and on and on with the problems related to excessive light for sure.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with that. And so it's about trying to have the evidence to say, well, if we want to prevent people from tripping up, we need this. Ideally, you need this much light. Or, we could also say, okay, well, if we want to encourage people to walk at night and feel safe enough to walk, perhaps we need this amount of light. So that I think we need to be clear about what purpose we want the lighting to serve, and it might not always be lighting's role to do that. It's not necessarily lighting's role all the time to make somebody feel safe. There's a whole range of other factors that influence our perceptions of safety in terms of, whether we think an environment, a neighborhood feels safe to walk in. So it's about deciding what's the purpose of lighting and what is the evidence that would support the use of lighting, and how much lighting, and what type of lighting do we need.
It's interesting that you're talking about a standard or a code book where you would go to sections 3.1, you'd flip to there and you'd read something in the code, and you would think that has been researched. Like if you're looking at an IES standard or a CIE standard, and you would think that is backed by double blind survey studies that have been peer reviewed, and I'm going to say it, I'm in the lighting industry. I've been here for a long time. I'm the host of the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast. I've talked to tons of scientists and lighting designers. I think they make it up as they go along, Dr. Uttley. I'm not kidding you. I'm serious. Like I think they just pick things and they go with it, and I don't think they're paying attention to the broader role of lighting in society. Are they paying attention to all the factors, all the influences? No, they just default to brighter and whiter and better is better, and to make it as bright as possible. And that should be good for everybody.
I agree. I do agree, because unfortunately, possibly like some of my fellow scientists and researchers might not like me for saying this, but unfortunately, there's a lot of bad science out there. There's a lot of kind of collating evidence, but actually, it's the whole GIGO principle. Garbage in, garbage out. So if you do poor research, but you come up with a conclusion, that conclusion, and that conclusion then influences the sort of the lighting standards, for example. Well, that lighting standard is then therefore going to be worthless itself anyway. So, unless we have really good, strong, robust evidence,
it's worse than worthless. It's damaging. You see, that's the problem, is that we're actually, when we have bad standards, they're not worthless. They're damaging. They actually do active damage out there. And, and this is what's happened in the lighting industry. Now we have a whole, our critical infrastructure is filled with unrepairable, super bright 5,000K lights that are not repairable, thankfully, so we can get an opportunity to change them here. But like the way that the lighting industry made decisions on this was clearly not evident. In fact, I think they actively discouraged evidence, Mark Baker, if you think in terms of Dr. Mata's, when he contacted them about the pituitary gland and melatonin and all that sort of stuff, Dr. Uttley, and they just completely ignored the man.
Yeah. I have a kind of an example of this, I suppose, that's quite close to my heart. So my partner is from a part of the UK. It's in the sort of northeast of England, an area called South Shields, on the coast. And so I visit there quite often, and her parents still live there. And so their parents live on very, very close to the coast. And there's a road that runs along their road, along by their house. And essentially there's then a green area, and then there's the coast, essentially. And up till now, that road hasn't been lit. And so my partner's kind of parents have been very, very vocal in trying to ensure that it continues not to be lit. However, the council, in their wisdom, have obviously got some money to put some streetlights across their district, and they've decided to put streetlights onto this street. So that was previously a lovely, like, dark, you could really see the stars and stuff. It was a lovely dark sky area. It's right adjacent to a not quite a national park, but a very green area that has lots of kind of migrating birds on it and lots of wildlife. And so obviously, me as a lighting researcher, I started to look at this, and we actually looked at the evidence about. And so the local authority was arguing that, well, we need lights here because they just installed a cycle path along that road, and they said, well, we need the lights to ensure traffic safety. And so we looked at the kind of the stats around, how many crashes there'd been on this road over the last 20 odd years, and how many of those crashes happened at at night compared with daylight. And we were actually able to show that on that particular stretch of road, there was much fewer crashes at night
Hmm.
than on comparable roads that were lit. And so completely, blows the council's argument out of the water that, they're arguing, well, we need the lights on here because it's not safe otherwise. And we're actually showing, well, this has a disproportionately small number of crashes at night. So why are you putting the lights here? But they continue anyway. So it's kind of, I think it's that thing when you've got money and they want to show the local community
Sure.
that we're investing in this area without actually thinking through, is this actually needed? Is it something that's gonna, evidence based and is gonna have some benefit? And my worry actually is that, there is some evidence to show that if you light a particular street, you might start to get vehicles driving faster, and it's
Hmm.
that can then increase,
Hmm.
uh, you know,
Totally.
traffic risk and stuff.
I,
So when
I
you don't have, if you have a dark street, it can actually potentially sometimes make it safer.
before I throw it back to Mark, I live in a rural area, and I think it's safer to drive without streetlights. And because you can see the lights of cars coming from a long distance away, you can see that there's another car
Yeah.
down the road coming towards you. And that's a huge factor in safety. And people for sure drive slower on unlit rural roads, Mark Baker. I'll tell you that for sure. Over to you.
Wow. That's exactly right. I want, if I'm in a vehicle and I've got my headlights on my car, my halogen headlights, by the way, uh, that's already lighting. I don't want light in my eye, which is what's typically happening. I don't want that glare. It's making it more dangerous. I don't want to feel actually the discomfort of this dark area. This everything's dark, and then you have a light. It's distracting. It ruins my mood, and then I feel that it's less safe because I'm kind of closing one eye or something to avoid the glare, and it's wasteful on money. Um, so what a poor decision, but it's so common with the city councils to
Hmm.
show that they're doing something. It's just mindless use of money. When we had COVID funds here in the US, I think a bunch of that money was spent on street lighting. Just because it's a project, it's an infrastructure project that they can say they're doing something to improve safety. Dr. Utley, maybe my final question is maybe about the upper limits on the light, because there are a lot of regulations here in the US that has a minimum level, and it's almost non-existent for a maximum level. And in addition, there's two types of levels. There's this illuminance that falling on the roadway, and then in the US, there's zero regulations for luminance, which is the light that's directly viewed. That's a disaster. So, in your research, are you coming across any kind of limits on the upper side?
Yeah, good question. So, to put it bluntly, not really. I mean, the problem is, again, it comes down to what does the research and the evidence base say. For me, as a scientist, that's I always go back to the evidence base, and unfortunately, there's a lot of the research you will find that it will always advocate for brighter is better, and one of the reasons for this is a purely methodological kind of basis. So if you were to just to give you an example, if you were to um, show people a range of different light levels, from sort of low to high, generally they might their preferences are usually for somewhere in the middle. And so it doesn't really matter what that range is, their preferences tend to form around the middle. So if you imagine, you could give them quite a low range of light levels and say, right, what's your, how much light do you need to see what you need to see? And they'll go in the middle. But if you could give them a really, really high range, and again, they'd go somewhere in the middle. And so the problem with this is like any researcher that starts to use higher and higher light levels in the kind of the range of stimuli that they're showing to people will always end up saying, oh, we need a brighter level, because of the nature of humans, and it's kind of a methodological, it's kind of a human bias that we have, something called range bias. And so this is why we need particular kind of methodological designs that overcome this range bias, and that's what we try to use. And so, yeah, I would always be cautious of any research or evidence that is kind of advocating for like higher and higher levels of light. Or I think we need to be careful about what evidence we're looking at, really. So yeah, I think I would always say, well, does the if we have a minimum light level, surely that should be just what we should aim for, essentially. And why do we
Mm-hmm.
need any light level above that?
Mm-hmm.
Because what benefit is that gaining? The one caveat I would put to this, I suppose, is the fact that we do have different demographic groups of people. So, for example, older people might need slightly higher light levels than younger people because of kind of changes in our eyes and
Or
that sort of
slightly
thing.
less. Or slightly less. Because there was some
Yeah,
research that I saw that really bright lights affected older people's eyes going under bridges. And when they came out the other side, it took them seconds to recover their eyesight,
yeah,
as opposed to you and I, maybe it
yeah,
takes a quarter of a second or something. So that
yeah.
goes
No,
both
that's
ways. Yeah.
yeah. It's fair comment. Fair comment. Definitely, I'll definitely take that. Yeah. I mean, that's around issues around glare as well. So that perhaps that's where we might think about maximum light levels, and at what point are we actually glaring people and causing discomfort from glare or disability glare, and actually making it really hard for people to see. And yeah, that probably comes under that category of how are we adapting back to the darkness after we've been exposed to really high levels, high light levels.
I know we're coming up on time here. You got a hard stop here, Dr. Utley. I understand that. I really appreciate, this conversation. It was extremely endarkening for me. Um, but I want to correct you on one thing that you said, and I hope you'll forgive me for this. You said
Sure.
that garbage in, garbage out. No, I
Mm.
wish. It's garbage in, garbage stays, and you can never get that garbage out. That's the problem with it. It just stays in there in that manual that sits on someone's desk for,
Oh,
forever, for their whole career, right? That's the problem with garbage. It stays in the system
It says
and
that.
we can't
Yeah.
get it out, and it damages and damages. It's not worthless, it damages. Folks,
Mhm.
I want to thank Dr. Utley for being on the show. All of his links will be down in the show notes. If you want to take a quick minute, you can go to restoringdarkness.com. You can donate to the Soft Lights Foundation, and that's Mark Baker's work. He's a truffle hound out there digging through all the laws to find ways that he can make a difference, and we love him for that. So go to restoringdarkness.com/donate, or you can donate directly to the Restoring Darkness production. Help pay Scott. He's hungry. He needs money. The producer, Mark and I are both volunteers. So you can do that there. And of course, to you, the listener, whatever you do, if you're an environmentalist, you're in the lighting industry, whatever, we got to start talking about this. The most important thing for you to do is to talk to your colleagues about some of these axiomatic presuppositions. More light equals more safety. That's not necessarily true. It's not evidence based. And we thank Dr. Utley for making that crystal clear for us. And for you out there, thank you for listening. Bye for now.